Thank you, Dondra. Thank you. And thank you, Lisa, for the invite. Kind of coming back to familiar territory here. Okay, so I'm going to spend the hour talking to you guys about photojournalism and why it's important. To start, who can tell us, in your own words, what is photojournalism? Anyone? Yeah.
It's documenting current events in use of photographs.
Perfect. Documenting is a big part of that definition there. Anybody else? There's a simple two-word definition that we can use to describe what he just said. It is visual storytelling. Okay? Photojournalists are journalists first, and they're photographers second. At least that's the way I always saw my job, because I always saw myself first as a journalist. If you see yourself as a photographer first and then a journalist, you could end up in some trouble, because you have to be trained like a journalist is. You know, you have to know interview skills. You have to know how to deal with people, since we dealt with people on a daily basis. Issues of ethics and taste are things that you have to know as a journalist. So you encompass everything that's about journalism, but we are reporters who report visually, right, with the visual image. And that medium is the still image, the still photo. The still photo is still the mainstay to what I do as a photojournalist, what I did. A photojournalist uses the print still photo as a medium, okay? Now we have to qualify that a little bit now, because photojournalists are now doing video too, okay? When I started in this business a long time ago, I was strictly a still photographer, and video was like, as far as the moon to me. I mean, I didn't know anything about it. But toward the latter part of my career at the newspaper, I found myself shooting and doing a lot of video, probably about one almost every day, okay? So that's a part of photojournalist work now. But having said that, the primary medium is still the still journalistic picture, okay? And there are a couple of components to that I want to tell you about. The first one is kind of something that separates photojournalism from other forms of photography, or from photography in general. And that is that the still photo, the journalistic still photo, has to have what we call news value, okay? You guys know what that means. It has to inform. It has to say something to the viewer. If it fails to do that, then there's no real point in showing it, right? So the second component is what we call the visual, or it's what we call the graphic ingredients. And this is where the creativity of the photographer comes in, because photojournalism is definitely a creative field, okay? There are a lot of tools in a photographer's toolbox, so to speak, on how to approach covering news-making events, okay, that a photographer can use in order to enhance their photos. The big purpose here is to take photos that capture people's attention, okay? That's the big part of it, and this is why photojournalism is such a creative field. Some of those things are like camera angle, okay? Camera angles. There are a few camera angles that we employ. What's the most common camera angle in photography? When we talk about the angle that you're taking a picture, it's like this. It's called standing position, okay? And it is overused, right? Because everybody takes pictures that way. But there are different angles. There's a high angle, look, kind of pointing down. And anyone who's seen me work has seen me do that a lot because that's an angle that I like to shoot. One of the reasons is because when I shoot under buildings that have fluorescent lights, I hate those fluorescent lights in my shot. I just don't like to see them. So when I shoot up high like this, one of the reasons is that I'm cropping out the lights in the ceiling, okay, because they just draw people's attention for no reason. Another angle is down, looking up, okay? Things that you can do to add interest to your picture, aside from just the standing position. Another tool is focal length. Who knows what that is when we talk about focal length in photography? We're talking about the type of lens that you're using, okay? There are basically three types of lenses that we use. One of them is telephoto. Another one is a medium lens. And then the third is a wide angle lens. And they all serve a specific purpose, right? Telephoto lenses compress your subject. They compress the photo. For example, the subject against the background. And they tend to isolate everything that's around your subject to where you're kind of just focusing in on your subject. That's what telephoto does, okay? Telephoto lenses are used when you need to get close to your subject, but you cannot physically be close to your subject. And then the wide angle is the total opposite. It lets a lot of area, a lot of scene into your picture with a wide angle lens. Medium-sized lenses are somewhere in the middle of that. They delve a little bit into the telephoto and a little bit into the wide angle. And I use that lens all the time. I often use the medium-sized lens because it gives you a lot of versatility. Okay, another tool would be like lighting. Lighting is everything in photography, right? You got to have it to have photography, okay? And the quality of that light is what often determines a really nice photo from a not very nice photo. In other words, if you find lighting to be really nice and soft lighting, it can really do a lot for the look and feel of a picture. Whereas harsh lighting, often what we find outside, like at 12, 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, if you're shooting pictures of people out there, you'll see the harsh lighting, the shadows on the eye sockets and under the nose and under the chin. Really a bad time of light to be shooting outside in those hours. So the quality of light has a lot to do with the quality of your picture. So we're always looking at lighting. When I walk into a space, whether it's a place I've been to many times or the first time, I always check out the light. And I determine, is the lighting suitable for me to take available light pictures inside of there without me having to use some of my own light, the light that I carry in the 2 flash units that I carry in my bag. Sometimes it's a combination of both of them, okay? But this kind of light is really nice, these new lights in these newer buildings, because this is what we call daylight balanced lighting. It's balanced to daylight, which means if I took a photo in here, your skin tones would be just right, okay? In some of the older buildings around town and on this campus and other campuses, they still have fluorescent lighting, fluorescent tubes. And when those fluorescent tubes are new, it gives you really nice light, but as they age, they change color. And oftentimes, if you're only shooting with available light, you're going to get magenta skin tones. Okay, you get magenta looking skin tones on people. And then you have to go in there and correct it because it wasn't really there to begin with. It was caused by the lighting, okay? So light is a real big consideration in photography. And if you learn how to use light to your advantage, you'll be very happy with the result you get, okay? Let's talk about one other. How about moment pictures? Photojournalism is often about taking compelling moments in time. A compelling picture is going to get a lot of looks because people like to see compelling moment pictures. Okay, so there's a lot of latitude on how a photojournalist can show a picture of a newsmaking event that they go cover. Okay, it's all in here. When the photographer looks at things, the mind is working. What do I need to use? What lens do I need to use? Is this lighting good? Do I have to add some of my own? What kind of angle is appropriate for me to use here to make my picture as interesting as I possibly can? Okay, so why is it important? Photojournalism gives a face to the events that are happening. Okay, it helps the viewer identify with the person or persons that are part of that event or that are being affected by that event. Okay, and for that reason, stories that are accompanied with photos are much higher read in every survey that's ever been done than stories that don't have pictures. Because photos serve like a hook, right? They hook the person to go into the story and read the story. Okay, so photojournalism does that because it's a very powerful tool when you think about it. There is no limit, really, on how much emotion or how much expression can be shown in a visual image. It can be very powerful, okay? And in the same way, there aren't any limitations in terms of culture and language. Sometimes people argue that photography is kind of like its own universal language because it's understood by every culture on the planet. People look at an image and they right away understand what's going on in it. Okay, and that's a real big advantage that photography has. Another reason why photojournalism is important is because he mentioned that earlier. Photos document history. They serve as a document to history. Okay. Ever since the invention of photography, it's been used to document historical events that have happened over time. And some of them have become what we call cultural icons, which means their images, because of the visual impact that they've had, help describe a major event that happened in world history to the point where that image itself becomes the embodiment of that event. Okay? I think of 9/11. I know you guys weren't around in 9/11, but your parents were around in 9/11. September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks. When I think back at that event, I think of an image of firefighters raising the flag on a crooked pole with the rubble of the World Trade Center in the background. When I think of 9/11, that's the image that pops in my head. And there were a few other images that were very good that became iconic images in 9/11, but I think that's the one for me anyway that stands out. World War II, the D-Day invasion. Have anyone remember or hear about the D-Day invasion of Normandy on June the 6th, 1944? Well, there was one photographer who captured the iconic image that describes the D-Day invasion. His name was Robert Capa. He was considered and is still considered the greatest war photographer ever because he was fearless. He went on the first wave of the invasion wave that hit the beaches of Normandy. Okay, he was on that first wave. And he recalled later the bullets whizzing by his head. And he took a picture of a soldier waiting in the surf about chest deep, trying to get to the beach, okay, with the obstacles, the metal obstacles that had been put by the Germans along the beach to try to slow their advance. Not a particularly awesome picture. I mean, it was grainy. It was there's movement in the picture that I'm sure he didn't intend to have, but I think his shutter was a little slow, so it picked up a little movement in it. But nevertheless, that picture has come to embody the invasion of Normandy, that one picture. Something interesting that happened to him, though. We would have seen a lot more pictures of the D-Day invasion from him and other photographers, but from him in particular, because he shot 2 rolls of film, and once he made it to the beach and to an area where he could meet a courier who picked up his film and flew it to London to be processed and put in the pages of newspapers in the US and Life magazine and all these other publications. The guy who developed his film, just an interesting side note, seared his negatives. In other words, he burned them because he put them in a film dryer, and it was so hot that the celluloid on the film was seared, and only 8 pictures out of his 2 rolls were usable. Think of that, risking your life to get these pictures, and then some guy over there in the lab. I mean, I don't know what I would have done if I were him, or something like that, okay? But one of those 8 pictures is the one that has come down in history as the one that really embodies the invasion of Normandy. So there are a bunch of other pictures that have happened through time, through the decades, that come to embody major events that have happened in the world. And that's why photojournalism is such an important tool, and why photography is such an important way in which we receive information, okay? All right, I am going to show you, oh, by the way, are there any questions so far? Okay, I'm going to show you a series of photos. Who's seen these before or seen the website before? Stefan, most of you have not? Okay, good. These pictures, I put this website together some years ago as an instructional tool to show students the different categories of photojournalism, at least according to my categories of photojournalism. But if you were to separate the kind of pictures that you take in photojournalism, this is the way you would normally separate them, okay? I start with black and white for a reason, okay? Black and white was the mainstay of photojournalism forever, for decades and decades and decades. And when I first got to the newspaper in the mid-'80s, the El Paso Times was still 100% black and white, okay? But it wasn't just the Times here, it was papers throughout the country were still all black and white, okay? Color film was invented in 1935. Kodak came out with Kodacolor film in 1935. Why all the black and white? When we look at all the photos that we have from World War II, World War II didn't start till 4 years after that. And yet all the pictures that we see from the Second World War are grayscale black and white, right? Why do you think that was? You think something new comes out, oh, color, yeah, I'm gonna go get color. It didn't happen that way. Sometimes things take a long time to change. And in the case of color versus black and white, it took an awfully long time for that to change, okay? So early in my career, we were all black and white. We were all wet darkroom. Come back, develop your film, look at it under a light, pick your negative, go into the darkroom, put it in an enlarger, put a piece of photographic paper, and expose it to light. And then you would take the trays and you would develop it in chemistry, okay? Later on, the first digitization of photojournalism or of photography happened when they invented a film scanner that would, rather than making a print in a darkroom, you put the film in a scanner and it scanned it. And then all of a sudden it became a digital picture after that. Okay, so it was a little bit of a step in the process of going from photochemical to digital, okay? The El Paso Times went digital in 2000. So it wasn't that long ago that we were shooting with film, okay? And black and white film was just a lot cheaper than color film because we would buy the film in 100-foot rolls and we would put it in a film loader and we would manually load our own rolls of film. And black and white was just cheaper to use, and that might be one of the reasons why. But the other thing too is the public had a hard time getting rid of black and white because they had always been used to seeing photography in black and white. It was never color until people started to warm up to it, and it happened when these older generations of people, they were just so accustomed to seeing black and white. Nowadays, you guys grew up seeing color. So black and white to you guys might seem like a real foreign thing to you. But to previous generations, that was the way they looked at photography, through black and white, okay? So that's the reason why I'm showing some black and whites here, to give you an idea of where photojournalism was up until about the late 80s, early 90s, okay? When the El Paso Times and all these other papers began to run color. First, we ran color on the front page, and everything else inside was still black and white. Eventually, though, the whole paper went color, but it, like I say, it took an awfully long time for that transition to happen. I'm going to lower this down, I think, a little bit. Let's see. Okay, in this picture, this is a picture of Fort Bliss soldiers retiring the flag on the center flagpole at Fort Bliss. I was coming out of an assignment. I saw them up there. It was 5 o'clock. They bring the flag up in the morning, and at 5 o'clock, they retire the flag. And I saw them up there, and because the sun was coming in kind of to their back and to the left, it silhouetted them. You know what we mean by a silhouette, right? It gave them the shape, but not the detail. But the light was still illuminating most of the flag, so I took a picture of that just as a feature shot, and it ran that way as a feature photo, okay? How would that have looked in color? I'm not sure that it would give off the same feeling that black and white gives off, okay? Okay, so I went to an air show. This was the first year that I was working as a full-time photographer. I went to an air show in Holloman Air Force Base near Alamogordo, and the PIO guy there, the public information officer of the base, said, hey, the Golden Knights, U.S. Army Golden Knights parachute team is gonna go up, and would you like to go? And I'm like, you mean up in the plane? And he said, yeah. I'm like, yeah. So they put me in a flight suit with some tethers, with these tethers, and they strapped me. When the door of the plane came down, when it opened up in the back, they clipped me to these clips that you see on the floor there, so that I wouldn't accidentally fly out with these guys, okay? But it gave an interesting angle that you couldn't do when you were on the ground. When you're on the ground, you're taking pictures of the planes flying around and people looking at planes, but you couldn't get an angle like that unless you went up on the airplane. This was a very common scene years ago, okay? Along the border in downtown, people would come over. When the water was in the river, they would come over on inner tubes. Okay, they had enterprising guys would get an inner tube, put a piece of plywood on it, and they would give people rides across the river over to El Paso and back. And nobody cared. There was a fence, but there were holes in the fence all over the place. And people would just say, hey, I need to go to El Paso. These people weren't documented or had the papers or anything. So they would just float across, come up, go do their business in El Paso, maybe go to work, and then a lot of them would go home in the afternoon, back to Juarez. So this was a very common scene back in the early 90s, and then around 1995, all of that changed, because then they instituted what was called Operation Hold the Line. the Border Patrol Sector Chief at the time, Sylvester Reyes, who became our congressman for 16 years after he retired from the Border Patrol. He instituted Operation Hold the Line, where they finally, they stopped the people from going back and forth, okay? And ever since then, we haven't been able to see this sort of scene anymore. This was just a fun feature shot that I found in the lower valley. I saw these kids jammed into a go-kart, and I said, oh, I'm gonna shoot those kids as they come at me. And then suddenly the stray dog gets in my frame, okay? And the kids are like looking at the stray dog, like, is he gonna stay there, or are we gonna hit him, or what's gonna happen? And so it just turned out to be another element in the picture that I didn't want, but it still turned out to be a decent little feature photo that they used in the local section of the paper. So this one is a bunch of concrete pipes. There was a drainage project going on in the lower valley, and this kid was sitting there waiting for a friend to come out of school. And I noticed the way the sun was hitting the edges of those concrete pipes, okay? And I thought, oh, there's a picture there. So I shot the photo, and then what I did, one of the things that we could do in black and white is really pop the contrast in the picture. When you pop up the contrast, the highlights of the picture, that is the highlight part, just pops. It becomes super bright. And that's what I did. I added a lot of contrast, and it gave just the circles on the end of the pipe something different to look at. Who remembers, well, I don't know if you will, there was a rodeo that used to happen every year called the Southwestern International Livestock Show and Rodeo at the Coliseum. It was a great thing. I mean, I loved shooting the rodeo, and it doesn't happen anymore. But it was a really cool thing. And one year I asked if I could kind of like do a behind-the-scenes picture story of what happens that people don't see. In the pen area where they take care of the animals, where they bring the animals in and out, where the cowboys are getting ready. And this was one of those pictures, literally behind the scenes look at the cowboys looking over at the bronc riding, or one of the events that was happening there. Who knows who that is? You can tell me who that is. I know the older folks can. What about you guys? No? Okay, Lisa. Billy Idol. Anybody heard of Billy Idol? No? He's a guy who was real big. He's a UK singer, rock and roll singer who was real big in the 80s. And he came to the County Coliseum for a concert, okay? And I got a gesture shot. It was a wider picture, including his waist, and I thought, no, I'm just going to key in on the face. So all I did was crop in on his face, okay? And the guy still performs. Doesn't quite look that young anymore, but he performs. And I just heard a week ago that he's going to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2026. Just an ironic thing about the guy. Okay, so this picture here was a little bit of a tense moment that happened on one of the bridges. In the 80s, there was a lot of electoral problems that was happening in Juarez. The ruling party at the time wanted to remain in power, but the opposition mayoral candidate won the election. So what did the elections people in Chihuahua do? They nullified the election so that the guy wouldn't take over. The opposition party candidate wouldn't become mayor. So the people revolted. They got really mad. They rushed one of the bridges, and they blocked the bridge. They wouldn't let cars pass. After a little later, here come the Mexican soldiers. They tried to root them out. So what did the people do? They just sat on the bridge. And it was a real tense moment, because if one of those soldiers had started shooting, they all would have started shooting, and it would have been a massacre. But luckily, after a while, because the people sat down and refused to leave, the soldiers were finally ordered to withdraw from that, okay? But that was a real tense moment there for a little bit. I also found this coming back from the bridge, crossing over the bridge. It's just a feature shot of a little kid sitting in a box. The mother was a Tarahumara mother, was selling chiclets to the cars coming over the bridge. And then when I walked by, I saw this little boy entertaining himself with a little box of chiclets sitting in this box. And it just happened to be an opportunistic picture. I mean, if you passed that, why wouldn't you take a photo, right? And it was just an interesting thing going on right there at the bridge. And we ran it as a feature photo. Okay, so here's some general news photos. Notice the size of this caption. Look at all that caption I wrote. I think it was a little too much, but when we run feature photos in the paper, they serve as a standalone element on the page, right? There's no story attached. It's just a photo with an explainer under it. So sometimes those captions tended to be longer than just a simple caption that went for a photo that went with a story. Because you had a story with it, you didn't really have to describe much else. But when it's a standalone picture like that, you have to say the when, what, where, and why of the event, all encapsulated in a caption. And that's the reason why it's such a long caption. But these soldiers from Fort Bliss were holding up this 100-foot flag as they were getting ready to hoist it up in this giant flagpole in the Northeast. And when I saw that, I thought, I know where I need to be. I need to be under there, because I knew that the light was going to be coming in from the flag, illuminating the flag. And again, the soldiers ended up being silhouetted as a result of me exposing my camera to the flag. There were 3 kids who went to party in Juarez. One of them had turned 18. And in Juarez, you could still drink at 18. Okay? Here, you're 21, but way back in the day, you could drink at 18 too. Well, when the age limit changed to 21, some of the kids was, hey, we can go drinking in Juarez. So they went over there, they partied. It was one of them was their 18th birthday. They came back and they wiped themselves out on Paisano, and all 3 of them were killed. Okay. I was passing near there 2 days later, and I know that oftentimes when some tragic thing happens like that, people go and they put a memorial of some kind on the scene. So I went by and I stopped and I saw this little boy there. I said, oh, there's somebody here just by chance. And he was a guy who knew all 3 of them. And he was grieving at their loss. When I went by to see it, it was just a chance encounter. Okay, so these B-52 bombers came to Biggs Army Airfield to train. They were on a training mission, and they were practicing air refueling the airplanes in the air. We saw very similar scenes just a couple of weeks ago when these bombers were being used in Iraq, right? We saw this sort of thing happening. And so they said, hey, would you like to go up? And I'm like, yeah. So I went up there and I shot it through the little window. The operator who operates this boom right here connects to the plane right here to refuel the plane in the air. And so that's how that happened. That person just got away from the window just for a little while so that I could take a picture of that.
You actually that high in the sky?
Yeah, this was over the Arizona border or Arizona-New Mexico border somewhere where they were practicing this refueling. Mm-hmm. Okay, so this was a feature shot that just had to be taken. Everybody knows, have you seen this mural around town? Where is it located? Lower Valley, right? Alameda and Zaragoza. I would pass by that mural and I'd say, one of these days I'm going to stop and I'm going to take a picture of this mural. The sun, this particular day, the sun was illuminating it really nice. So I parked, I walked a block or 2 to the corner and I just sat there and I waited. What if I had just shot the mural by itself? would it have had the same effect? I had to wait for somebody to go by, and I must have waited 45 minutes to an hour for somebody to walk by that darn mural. But I waited because it provides a scale for the mural, right? It tells you how big that mural is. It could have been 5 foot tall or 25 foot tall, but you wouldn't have been able to tell had I not introduced another element on there to tell the reader that this mural was that big, okay? And it adds a separate element to the picture also. Okay, this one is at the zoo. Sometimes they would say, hey, we're slow news day. We need pictures for the Borderlands section. We don't have anything. Go out and look for something. And the zoo was always a good place to go because it hardly ever disappointed. There was always some picture that we could get at the zoo, okay? And what was funny about this scene when I walked in, that sea lion was actually playing with these kids. It would make circles, it would open its mouth, and it was very aware of those kids, and they were like interacting together. It was really an amazing thing to see. All right, so this is when the famous Mexican singer Juan Gabriel died. He died at his home in LA or in California. He was from Juarez, right? So they took care of him in Percha's funeral home in El Paso, cremated him, and he was on his way back to Juarez for his funeral. And they put the urn on top of the hearse. And when the motorcade was making its way through Stanton to go over the Stanton Street Bridge into Juarez, there were hundreds of people that were lying both sides of the street to get a glimpse of it. Okay, and that's what is going on in that picture. We had heard that people from Juarez were coming into El Paso using the drainage tunnels that are under the city. So a reporter and I decided to go under one. We found a way to get into it somewhere at UTEP. We got in to this tunnel over at UTEP, and we sat there in pitch darkness, and then we could hear noise. And we knew that somebody was coming because the noise just reverberates inside that tunnel. We could hear people walking. And then before long, we saw these people coming with a lighted torch. It wasn't a flashlight, it was a torch, literally a torch. And they were walking through the tunnel, and it gave me an opportunity to take a picture to illustrate the story of how people were coming into the United States using these tunnels, okay? And this little thing right here is a puff of smoke that was from his lighted torch. And they saw us, we saw them, and they just kept walking. They didn't seem to care about us at all. So I was a little nervous there for a moment, but they were not interested in what we were doing at all. Just an example of how you can isolate a picture. I saw that little kid's face kind of wedged between the box that they're holding and a relative during a mass that was held at Mount Carmel Cemetery for loved ones who had been cremated. In other words, that box held the ashes of a loved one. And they had a special mass there outside at the cemetery. And that little kid peering through that box is just something that caught my eye. We saw a number of these kind of shots during the Iraq War. Soldiers from El Paso who came back, who were killed over there. And this was a family who went to receive the body of this soldier who died in Iraq, okay? The wife is standing there, the daughter to the right, the wife's father on the left. And obviously, what kind of lens do you think I used to shoot that? Definitely a telephoto. We weren't going to be right there. We got to respect the family. And they had asked the family if it was okay for the news media to be there when the casket arrived. And they consented to it. They even gave their names to the people there who passed the names to us. But we had to be at a distance, right? We weren't going to be obtrusive there in front of them. And so that was a 300 millimeter lens shot from, I don't know, 50 or 60 yards away. Okay. But it was cropped. And there's something I want to show you about cropping here in a little bit. Okay, so Pope Francis made his first visit to the United States in October of 2015. And they thought it was a big enough deal to send me and a reporter to Philadelphia to cover the Pope's first visit to the United States. Okay, so that photo was taken at night. I waited for him all day long, and he finally came by in the Pope Mobile, and it was dark, and I was wondering, I hope the Pope Mobile's lit up, otherwise I have no picture. And they sent me all the way over here for nothing. But sure enough, the Pope Mobile was lit up, and it allowed me to take that photo with about 20 minutes left in the deadline that they needed it. And this is how it showed up in the paper the next day. Now, little did they know that 4 months later, he would go to Juarez. If they had known that, they wouldn't have made the expense of sending us to Philadelphia if they knew he was coming to Juarez. 4 months later, he's in Juarez. Okay? And my assignment in that one, because we had all the entire photo staff was working this, because he was going to various different places. And my assignment was to capture to get his arrival and his departure at the Juarez airport. Okay? So here he's leaving. He's saying goodbye to people there. The then president of Mexico, Peña Nieto there, his wife is there, and he's been seen off back to Rome. This was a funeral of a soldier from Cañutillo who died in Iraq. She was a cook, and she was working in the mess hall in one of the bases, which you would think is a relatively safe place to be. But they lobbed a mortar shell from outside the base into the base. It hit the mess hall and it killed her. So this was the funeral in one of the churches in Cañutillo. Okay, so this is called Hose Day. If you're a fire department recruit, they make you go through this like on the second day of your training. You have to carry this hose and go all the way around Escarate. Because the training academy is there, Escarate Lake. They make you carry that all around the lake to see if you have the stamina that is required to be a firefighter. And after hose day, they always say there's a lot less recruits the next day because it kind of weeds out the ones who can handle it and the ones who can't. This was in the Cerezo prison. These were El Paso women. We did a story about El Paso women at Cerezo prison. The prison that's south of Juarez, or in South Juarez. And there were 4 women from El Paso who were incarcerated there. This one in the foreground, she was only 22 at the time, and she was in there supposedly for murder, robbery, and weapons possession, and then the girl in the background was there for illegal drugs. This was a feature shot. Again, look at the size of the caption I wrote. This was a feature shot of Matachines up at the base of Mount Cristo Rey. And that was a feature shot that originally started as a press conference about the new air cargo terminal at the airport. And suddenly this FedEx plane came in right when we were there. Turned out to be a much better picture than somebody at a podium. All right, a few spot news pictures here. These people were, their house was flooded, the whole neighborhood flooded after 3 days of nonstop rain. And they were evacuating their house, okay? In order for you to capture pictures like this, guess what? I was in the water with them, right? So sometimes you end up getting wet or you end up getting dirty when you do some of this kind of work. But sometimes you got to do those things to get the photo. Another spot news picture of a rollover accident. This was a fatal accident. This car was sandwiched between 2 semi-trucks, and the elderly woman in the car was killed in that one. a car fire on Trans Mountain Road. It was on my day off, so this is the reason why I always carry a camera everywhere I go, because you never know when something's going to happen right in front of you. Okay, a car underneath a tanker on I-10. This one here, this man was grieving his brother who passed away in a house fire. Okay, the man was living in the garage of the house. He was in his 80s. This man was in his 80s too. But if you guys know, they don't insulate garages. Okay, so if you're living in a garage, you need to either have air conditioning in the summer and you have to have heater in there in the winter. It was in the winter, and this man had a space heater in the garage, and somehow it caught fire. So it burned the garage. The man died, and the brother here was grieving the loss of his brother, and the neighbors came out to comfort him. This is what I mean, that when we cover news, we always look for the human angle. How is this event affecting people? Okay, so they went and hugged him, and then interestingly, the other neighbor on the left brought him a Mickey Mouse. I guess you're never too late to be comforted with Mickey Mouse, I guess. But she brought him a Mickey Mouse to help try to comfort him. This was a tornado that hit a small town about 200 miles from here, Zaragoza, Texas, Zaragoza with an S. It leveled the whole town, and there were 30 people who died. They were all inside this building. This was a community center, and they were all in there for a kindergarten graduation when the tornado went right through the town. Okay, and that was taken from a helicopter, as you can tell. All right, so I'm going to zip through some of these. This was the horrible thing that happened at the Walmart, 2019, okay? I received a notice on my phone saying, one of those Amber Alerts saying, active shooter. You guys may have remembered this. Active shooter, Walmart, do not go anywhere near the area, blah, blah, blah. 5 to 10 minutes later, I get a call from the Associated Press office in New York saying, we hear there's an active shooter. Can you go? So oftentimes when people are running that way, photojournalists are going that way. Sometimes we go the opposite way. But this is pictures from that event. Some crosses that were set up there, and then the flowers and things that were being left. You can see the Walmart in the background there. Okay. One thing I want to mention about sports photography, if it's a sport that involves a ball, you got to get the ball in the shot somehow, okay? The ball is an important part of the picture. So every time we shoot sports, we include the ball, okay? But look, notice something else about these pictures here. Look at how tightly they're cropped. You see how tight they are? I didn't shoot them that way, but I cropped them that way so that the eye of the viewer goes to what you want the viewer to see. If you left all this air around them, it doesn't really do anything to help the photo. So cropping is an important tool, a creative tool that we also use to show pictures. Cropping is always an important part of it. High school basketball, headers in soccer, when they do headers with their head, it's always a good picture. This was Jennifer Hahn in boxing, high school football, volleyball, more high school basketball action. The kind of pictures I like to shoot are when the ball is loose in the air. Those always make good pictures. That's wrestling. One of the things we do a lot in sports is cover jubilation. When a sports team wins, especially if it's a close game, they're jumping around and they're celebrating, right? So we always capture the jubilation at the end of a game. These are Notre Dame players that were celebrating a win at the Sun Bowl. This one was taken a year ago here at EPCC. Have you guys ever gone to see the baseball games here? EPCC has the only college-level baseball team in El Paso, okay? And they had a really good season last year. They went to the playoffs for the first time in years. And here they're celebrating a 2-run home run that one of them hit when he came across the base and hit home plate and came up to him, they all leaped in the air. Okay, quickly, portraiture. I was mentioning how light in the daytime and 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon can be very harsh, okay? I was taking a picture of these 3 players outside at about 3:30. The sun was still pretty high up and it was very harsh lighting. So I said, how am I gonna get rid of the light? Well, I used the light on my camera and I made it my main light source. How do you do that? You underexpose your shot by 2 or 3 f-stops, underexpose it. It sends the signal to your flash saying, oh boy, this is gonna be an underexposure. I better throw a lot of light out. And what it does is it throws a lot of light to the subject to try to compensate for the underexposure, okay, so that it gives you a proper exposure. And in doing that, your flash now becomes the main light source and the background goes dark, okay, goes dark every time. So it turned out to be a much better picture than if I had used the sunlight. Okay, this is window light, okay, one of the prettiest lights in photography is light that comes in from a window, okay? And he was a sax player. He's kind of made his name in the contemporary jazz realm. He's got several CDs out, and this was when he was just starting his career. His name is Mike Hamilton. Okay, same thing with this item right here, these 3 girls. Inside a gym, okay, I threw enough light on them to nullify the lights that were inside the gym so that you just isolate. The 3 girls in the foreground there. Okay, same thing with this shot. This shot was done the same way. It was inside the gym at El Paso High. There was all kinds of things going on in there. Kids running around, playing basketball. The kids are on the bleachers. And the only way to isolate that and take all your background out is to use 2 lights, one coming from the left, one coming from the right, illuminating them, and then the whole background just goes dark. That was a daylight photo at back of the band room at Franklin. That was about a librarian that we did a story on, a Fort Bliss librarian. You can see that I lit her up with a flash because you can see the highlight right here. That's the dead giveaway that I threw a flash at her from this way. If I had been able to eliminate that, it would have been a better picture. This was natural light coming in from a window at our Mijo pool when the swim team from Loretto Academy was out there. I saw the light and I said, hurry, hurry, get in the water, get in the water. The light is really beautiful right now, coming in through a window. And then a short time later, the light was gone. But I was able to use the light for that picture. Another feature portrait of the retiring CEO of El Paso Electric. Illustration photography is different from the other kind of photography we do in photojournalism in that illustration photography is done when we're purposefully creating a photo for a story that there is no photo for. In other words, we do a story, there's no real way to illustrate it with a real picture. We create a picture. And this one was about that little chili piquin. This reporter came to and said, I'm going to do a story on this little chili that's being grown in the farm fields up Highway 28 going to Mesilla, because it was all the rage in the gourmet food restaurants in New York and in Chicago and other places. And so they were growing it here for the gourmet food industry in these cities. But look at how tiny it is. And the thing that gives it scale is the size of the fork. The fork in the plate gives it scale. Okay. All right. I can tell you about this one. This one is a weird assignment I got again to photograph women's socks. The reporter came to me and said, here are 2 bags of women's socks. Have at it. I'm like, well, what am I going to do here? So I don't know why in my mind I thought instead of a rock concert, why not a sock concert? So I went through the trouble. I found mannequins from Dillard's and a band that I had photographed a few days before. Hey guys, come over here and do this picture with me. They showed up. I rented a fog machine and I shot this photo of a sock concert, okay? A lot of people saw it and said, what the heck is that? Why did you even try that? Okay, and a lot of people thought, hey, that's pretty creative. It's a different way of showing women's socks. But it took a lot. It took about a week's worth of planning to do that picture. And that's something that I don't think I'd ever try again. Here's denim outfits being modeled by a Miss USA. Another one showing shawls outside of a Steinmart. She was one of the employees there. She ended up being a good subject. These kids were at the Neon Desert Music Festival. They were showing their designs that they were putting on girls there. And this documentary piece was on the, it was called the Student Parent Center. It was run by EPISD. For many years they had this center, okay? They don't have it anymore. But it was for girls, young girls who got pregnant rather than just dropping out of school, which they almost always did. And then once they had their babies, they hardly ever went back to school to finish. So the whole idea here was to keep them in school, get them educated while they were pregnant, and also while they had, immediately after they had their babies, okay? So this school, it took about a year for me to get all the okays to go in there. And the parents had to sign a consent form saying it's okay if their child came out in photos. Of more than 100 girls that were in this program, only about 3 of them, the parents said no to. Everybody else said yes. So I was really impressed by the fact that that many people would allow me to take their photos, okay? So I only had to worry about 3 girls there. Here they're at lunch. They were allowed to take their babies at lunch. They would go to the nursery and take their babies to the lunchroom. And I wanted to go back to this place. They're taking their babies back here now from lunch, back to the nursery. They happened to have had a baby pageant while I was there. And all of these were taken in the span of about 4 hours, because I had hoped to go back periodically to capture more pictures and make it a more involved picture story. And they gave me 1 day. They said, you got till 8 a.m. till 2:30 in the afternoon to take these pictures. And that's an example of what we call documentary photojournalism. Documentary photojournalism is very different because it requires a lot of time, investment in time and effort to do a documentary piece, okay? It can take days, it can take weeks, it can take months to produce one, okay? And it's very involved and it's a very time-consuming projects to take. But oftentimes, if you find the right subject, it's usually worth the time and effort to do one, because you get into in-depth more than you would be able to otherwise. Some of these girls, like here, this girl right here, she was in the 8th grade. And there were a few other girls there that were in the 8th grade. Okay, so I wanted to leave a few minutes for questions, and I hope maybe you have a few questions. Go ahead, this young man here.
What was like your most, out of those photos, what was like the most memorable shot?
It's hard for me to answer that because I've been asked before, what was the best picture you ever took? And I just can't come to one.
I like that one.
Yeah, I just can't. I just can't nail one single image, or a bunch of shots that I like that I took over the year, that I had taken over the years. But in terms of a single image, no, I don't really.
Most difficult.
Most difficult were covering a special project we did on gangs. We hung out with some gangs in El Paso and in LA, and we got threatened by some gangs that said they were going to come shoot us up. And I was very worried about, for years, I was afraid. Because these guys, when they say something, they mean it. And they thought I had crossed them because we had gone to visit this gang. And we were talking to them casually about wanting to do a story on them. And they were like, no, you know what? No papirolean. Y luego, no, quién sabe qué. They didn't want to. And so we left. We said, okay, goodbye. And then I'm riding with some cops. I'm doing a ride along with police. And where do those guys go? They go to the same neighborhood where we were at a month before, you know? And they get out and they start checking these guys and they start patting them down and stuff like that. And I knew they were partly doing it for me, for a show. And I didn't want that. I wanted to capture things actually happening. So they saw me at a distance. I didn't walk up there because I said, I'm not going to go. I know who these guys are. One of them had an Uzi, and I said, I'm not going to go near these guys. But they spotted me by the police car. And then they assumed that I had sent them there. Okay? So they threatened to go to my house and shoot up the house and blah, blah, blah. Luckily, they never found out where I lived. Okay? Years later, 5, 6 years later, I'm touring the jail. I'm out there touring the jail. And who do I see there? One of these guys there in jail. And, you know, I'm a telltale giveaway with the camera bag and the camera. You know, he put 2 and 2 together. I saw him and I went, oop. I right away went the other way. I said, I'm not going to even have this guy look at me. Because like I say, once they make a promise, they mean it. And it could be years later that they see you and they'll still be upset at you. So that was one of the ones that I was a little concerned about. But it was a long concern. It was over a span of years that I was afraid of running into these guys. What was your question?
You mentioned earlier how you always carry your camera with you because you never know when something big's going to happen. You just want to document that.
Right.
I was wondering if there was any significant event that happened and it would have made for an amazing picture, but you weren't able to get a picture either because you didn't have your camera with you or something else happened.
That's happened once or twice when I got caught without a camera. Yeah. But guess what, guys? Everybody has a camera now. So if I don't have my real camera, I've got this camera. And if everything fails, at least I've got this one. Okay, now I have a fallback camera now. And it's not the same quality as a DSLR, as a mirrorless camera that we use, but in an emergency, it does okay in an emergency. Yeah, but I always carry a camera with me in the trunk of the car everywhere I go, because news-making events don't happen 9 to 5 or Monday through Friday. They happen whenever they happen, and so if you're ready, there's been more times that I'm happy that I had a camera on me than unhappy that I didn't have a camera on me when stuff like that happens. And then as a photojournalist, you're kind of like always on call. I mean, I could get a call at 3 in the morning, like that tornado picture I showed you. That happened at 8:30 at night, and I'm asleep, and about 2, 3 in the morning, I get a call from work. They said, we heard there was a tornado. It's about 200 miles from here. Can you get on your horse and run over there, go pick up a reporter? So I called the reporter, and I said, hey, can you be ready in an hour? I picked him up. We drove down there. We got there as the sun was coming up. And when the sun came up, we were just unbelieving of what we saw. What was once a town was completely gone. I mean, completely obliterated. And the thing about that one is 10 years later, that same reporter and I went back to Zaragoza to see what had happened in 10 years. And to my surprise, the town had come back. There were new buildings built. The state built a new community center. There was a new church. There was all this stuff going on, because sometimes when a tornado levels a town like that, sometimes people just don't go back. They just move away and the town dies. But in this case, the town came back, and it was a more vibrant community 10 years later. Yeah.
How has your job in the APCC compared to your time as a photojournalist?
Well, see, I work in the marketing department now here at EPCC. I was an instructor here for a while, for about 9 years, and then their photographer retired. Their photographer here at EPCC, who had been here like 27 years, he retired in August of 2022. And I was asked, because I was teaching here, I was said, hey, can you help us out while we transition to another photographer, so on and so forth. So I started helping them out, and it went on for like 8 months. I mean, it was a long time before they finally posted the job. And then when they posted the job, I said, well, what the heck? I've been doing it 8 months. I may as well go in for it, and I did. And that's how I got this current job, which I got in July of 23 July 6th of 23 was when I was officially hired to do the marketing job here at EPCC. And it varies a lot, because here it's a lot of setup pose type pictures, but by its nature, it's what it is. You cover events where, you know, you shake hands and here's your award, or here's your plaque, or here, or there's a lot of that sort of thing, a lot more than it did at the newspaper. At the newspaper, it was more, things were more spontaneous. Things happened, and the variety of the kind of pictures that I had to take was much more than the variety of pictures that I have to take here. But I kind of welcomed that, okay? Because after a while, and for all the years, I was like an adrenaline junkie. I mean, I just kept going and going. Working for a paper, it just never stops. There's just always something going on. So it was intense. It was just running gun almost all the time. And here you're more relaxed. Here I can have more time in between assignments to do other work and to get things out. So it's very different than what it used to be in the El Paso Times. El Paso Times was very intense, but I loved it. That's the thing that got me going in it. It was like, it was no longer just a job with a paycheck. It was like a lifestyle, is what it really was, because everything I did revolved around my work. You know, everything, even my wife, revolved around my work. You know what I mean? I mean, I would take off anytime I had to go. I'd go out of town anytime they sent me. Getting vacation time was like pulling teeth, because, you know, it was hard to get a vacation time over there because there was so much going on all the time. And then we lost some of the staff. And so the photographers that we had left, well, we were very busy. So it was even hard to get time off. But it was the most rewarding thing I've ever done. I mean, it was, I'm not the kind that can sit in an office, have four walls, and do the same thing over and over and over. I would climb the walls in 2 weeks. I would be out of there. I loved being out. I loved being around people. And that's exactly what this job was. It was being out there in the community. You never knew from one day to the next where you were going to go or who you were going to meet. And it was that uncertainty that was kind of a cool thing. It really drove me, because every day was different. There were no 2 days that were exactly the same, okay? And you always testing your skill, because we go into very different lighting situations. Every kind of lighting situation you can think of, we're going to encounter it somewhere. You know, sometimes you have 2 or 3 different light sources, and the white balance on your camera is trying to determine which one it is. And sometimes you take a picture and the skin tones are like yellow. And so you got to figure out how to solve those problems, because you don't want yellow skin tones. You don't want a magenta skin tones. You need to have well exposed pictures all the time. It was no excuse for you to come back and say, well, the room was dark and I got real dark pictures. That's not going to fly. Okay, you have to figure out how to solve these problems every single day. It was a challenge to solve lighting issues, to get moment pictures. But that's what made the day go so fast, you know, is it was just a fun job. I mean, it was just a job that I would do again. If I were young again, I would get back into it, but one of the things that they didn't tell me, though, when I started in this business, I was a student at UTEP, and I got a job at the college paper. And it was during that time that I was working at the college paper that I met the photographers at the El Paso Times. Okay, I met the photo editor at the time. And I got to know them, they got to know me. And then after a while, the photo editor would say, hey, Rudy, I got an event going on Saturday. Could you do it for us? And I'm like, yeah. I mean, the first thing I wanted to do was get my foot in the door there. So I started working on weekends and holidays, the time that the photo staff at the Times wanted to be at home with their families. 4th of July, Christmas Eve, New Year's Eve, New Year's Day. All those holidays, I worked for them so that the photo staff could be home, see? And the whole reason for doing that was because I wanted to get into the staff of the El Paso Times. So by the time I was a senior in my undergraduate program, I was already working full-time at the newspaper, okay? And it was because of the persistence that I had. Another thing I did is that I would carry a police scanner with me. The way we found out when things were happening was listening to the police and the fire and the EMS and the state troopers and the sheriff's office. We would hear when there was an accident or something serious, we would run to it. So what I would do is I would sleep with that scanner on, And then when I would hear the fire beeps, beep, 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 I would hear there's a fire somewhere, like say a structure fire, building fire in the middle of the night. I would get up and go to it. And then I would tell the photo editor, Louis, guess what? You know that big warehouse fire at 3 o'clock in the morning? I got it. I'm like, what? You were there? You know? And they would buy my pictures, and it helped to supplement my, I was a poor college student. I mean, every time they bought a picture from me, it was $25. And back then, $25 bought more than $25 buys right now. So I would do it to supplement my income too. But at the same time, my end game was getting into the paper. That's what I wanted to do. So finally, when somebody left, which wasn't often, when somebody left, I happened to be in the right spot to take that job. And I was a staff photographer for 8 years. Then I became the assistant photo editor for about 3 or 4 years. The photo editor left, and I became the photo editor at El Paso Times for 5 years, okay? And it was okay. It was an okay job, but I wasn't out in the community anymore. I was inside in meetings. I was covering meetings. I was running interference between the editors and the photo staff, which was like not a real fun thing to do. So finally I got tired after 5 years, said, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to go back out and shoot. So I became the senior photographer of the El Paso Times from then on until I retired in 2019. I was the senior photographer. That was the last title I had there. Yeah.
You said that you you would do like lectures here before you started working at the Barclay department.
Yeah, I started teaching. In fact, I was teaching this class.
What kind of assignments would you give to your students? Like, would you have them like go out and like?
Yeah, they would do examples of all those, which I think you guys are doing here now too, with Danja, right? You guys are doing different assignments for different genres just like that. So that's what we would do. They would have to go out and shoot. And what's neat about here, by the way, is that you have access to DSLR cameras. Okay, at UTEP, they don't do that. You have to have your own camera. In fact, in the very beginning, when I started teaching this class, there weren't any cameras, and students couldn't afford to buy a $600 DSLR. So what they would do is, you remember the little point-and-shoot digital cameras? I don't know if you remember these tiny little cameras that were around. Well, you don't see them anymore because the cell phone camera kind of put them all out of business. But back in the day, they would sell these tiny little point-and-shoot cameras, and that's what students were using for class. Okay, and then all of a sudden, they get a grant, and all of a sudden you have all these cool cameras at your disposal here. I mean, you check out a camera, and you can shoot with a real DSLR camera. And they don't offer that at UTEP. They don't offer that at some of these other places. You have to have your own equipment. So it's a really cool thing what they did here to do that for students. Yeah.
How many pictures would you take before you get one that, like how many pictures would you take during a shoot?
It would vary a lot on the type of assignment it was. But in sports assignments, for example, there'd be 600-700 pictures. Okay, and maybe it was only one half of the game, because you have a motor drive on your camera that's going. You see a play, you've got about 12 exposures in that one play. So you would end up having to look through 600 or 700 pictures of a sporting event and pick out 1 or 2 or 3 that stood out from all those pictures. If it was another type of event that was not a sports assignment, it would be a lot less than that. But it really depended on the type of assignment that you shot. If it was a boring press conference, which I hated to do, but they would send us to press conferences, somebody at a podium, it's real easy. I mean, sometimes it was just one shot and that was it. Yes?
How would you say you would network into this field pretty early on in your career?
To get into the business? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, basically, to...
Well, as I was explaining earlier, the way I did it is I started to freelance for them, okay? I was a broadcast major at UTEP. I thought I was going to be a radio announcer. And I was working at KTEP. I had a boardship at KTEP, and I was doing all this stuff. I'm going to be a radio announcer. But I always liked photography since I was a little boy. I used to take a little Kodak Brownie camera to elementary school, take pictures of my friends. And it wasn't until I got to high school, when I got into high school, I learned photography there, working for the annual and all of that. And then at UTEP, you had to be a sophomore to take photography. So I finally got to take photography as a sophomore. And when I got on at the student paper, there were 6 people applying for the job of chief photographer, including the incumbent. And I thought to myself, I've got a long shot getting this job. And sure enough, for some reason, they picked me to be the chief photographer of the school paper. And I was there for the next 2.5 years. And that's what really got the ball rolling for me in terms of getting into the newspaper, okay? But I would suggest to you guys, if you're interested in getting into journalism, get an internship, okay? Get an internship before you leave your 4-year program, whether here or at another institution. Try to get practical experience in before you graduate, because when there's 50 resumes for one job, and you're showing that you not only have the degree, but you have practical experience, they're going to separate you from the rest of them, okay? Because practical experience is what they want to see, even if it means doing a summer internship, even if it means leaving town to do an internship. Up until the last few years, I think the El Paso Times still had 2 summer internships, okay? They were not paid internships because you hardly ever see those anymore. But the main thing you get out of it is the practical experience that you're going to need. That is more valuable than any kind of payment, okay? So I would suggest getting an internship so that when you leave college, you have that too.
Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Thank you.